I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing at the Nature Conservancy to try and determine how our work should change in the context of climate change. And just in case you don't know, I'm just going to restate our mission. It's to preserve the plants, animals, and I have to read it actually, and natural communities that represent the diversity of life on Earth by protecting the lands and waters in which they need to survive. In California, we've actually taken reserve design, to our heart, as we have been everywhere in the Nature Conservancy, and we've actually designed the entire state for biodiversity conservation. And in doing so, we've identified 1,600 terrestrial, marine, and aquatic places that are unique places in California that we need to protect. It's 35% of the land area of California. 2,500 unique targets, species, natural communities, or ecological processes. So this is what reserve design gets you. It gets you 35% of California as necessary for conserving the biodiversity of California, this unique place on the planet, a global biodiversity hotspot. So reserve design actually isn't going to get us all the way to where we need to go, because we know how to design preserve. We just don't have the resources to implement them fast enough, particularly in the context of climate change. And if you look at some of the recommendations that you get for trying to figure out, well, how would you change your business in the context of climate change? This is the list you will often see in a lot of published reports. You manage for resilience, which you adaptively manage. So you put in some sort of management, you monitor, you figure out if your management is working, and you change your management practices if it's not. And you have key approaches, protect key ecosystem features. All the ideas of good reserve design come up again as the best practices for climate change. But again, this is conservation. This conservation practices, the things that we're already doing, the things that we already have in place. So how does our business change in the context of climate change? How should we be changing our goals or thinking about our business and how we do our work day to day differently? How do we change our priorities? How do we sequence our priorities differently in the context of climate change? And to get at that, I want to highlight how different this new place on the planet is that we're going to. There's been a lot of talk about projecting change, from where we are today, potential distribution to 2090, but there's a trajectory or a pathway to that, as many of you know. And this graph just comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2007 report as global mean temperature on this axis, and it goes from the year 1765 all the way to 2100. So it's actual temperatures and then projected temperatures in the future. It shows these different emission scenarios, or the different future pathways, development pathways we could take, from the greenest, which is B1, to business as usual, which is A1FI. And then it shows you, for all the models that came out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, 23 of them, their range in their output. So there's a lot that we don't know about what's going to happen to global mean temperature. Depending on which emission pathway we take, depending on the model you run, it could be anywhere from 1.5 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Fahrenheit up to 6.5 degrees Celsius. So great variety of where we could go in the future. And just to put it in the place, the current global mean temperature from the IPCC report is, or the change in temperature that we experienced is 0.7 degrees Celsius or 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. And I just want to put that in the context of the changes we've already seen. Melting glaciers, changes, as Craig talked, in the distribution of mammals in the Sierras, the distribution of butterflies, and some stresses, key stresses in the Southwest on some of our forests that have resulted in massive die-offs and forest fires. So already with just 0.7 degree change, we're seeing massive changes. And there's momentum built into the system as well. We are already committed to a global mean temperature, even if we froze the greenhouse gas emissions at 2000 and never emitted anything more. There's already momentum in the system to take us up even further. And then the HAHO report shows us for California, the mean annual temperature change in California from the years 2020 to 2050 will be around 2. And then, of course, if you take it out to 2080, we're talking about just a huge change in California. And we've already seen very significant impacts from what we have been. Just to show you again on the global, even if you just take the greenest of all those scenarios, the B1 scenario, and you look across 3 models, you have a change, and here's California right here, of about 6 degrees. This is just the same scenario, different model, about 4 degrees, and then about 1 degree. So the models don't even agree. So there is just a ton of uncertainty in the system that lots of people have addressed today. And so what can we do, changing our business practices in the future in the context of this uncertainty? Uncertainties in the emission scenarios, the global circulation models that we use to project climate impacts, taking those climate impacts down to a scale that are meaningful to a scale at which we do business on the ground, and then taking those climate impacts and translating them into impacts through species distribution models. How do we deal with that kind of uncertainty? Well, it's daunting, but if you read the climate change reports, they tell you if you're going to adapt to climate change, the first thing you need to do is to assess the impacts. And there's all that uncertainty and all that wide range of areas. So actually, the very first thing you need to do to figure out how you would adapt is to assess impacts, which is incredibly difficult. I worked on the climate change, the U.S. climate change science program's synthesis and assessment report on adapting federal lands to a changing climate. And we actually took this adaptation model and changed it to the resource management community model to be in words and in a way that we could actually understand what the words meant. Assess goals and impacts and scenarios, evaluate management goals, determine capacity to respond, and so on. And so this is just a list. And then we expanded how you would actually assess the goals and impacts and scenarios. So you can actually understand how radically your world's going to change relative to what you've been planning for already. And that's really important because I think that it's really hard to put in context what it's going to mean for a grassland, for a forest to become a grassland in 2080, what it's going to mean for you as a manager of these areas. So I'm just going to focus on one of our projects and walk you through how we're using this. And we're going to do this, we're doing this with multiple species and multiple natural communities, but I want to walk you through an example of how we're using this to help us think about how our business practice might change. We're not there yet, but how might it change? And this is a list of key target species from our Mount Hamilton range. And I'm going to pick on the checker spot butterfly, just like Mike did as well in our example. So this is our Mount Hamilton project, where we have planned at a very large landscape level for the protection of biodiversity for that whole suite of targets, the species, the natural communities, and the ecological processes. In defining and focusing on the bay checker spot butterfly, we went through each of those steps in understanding how you would assess impacts in your goals in that context. So you define the management goals, which are protect the bay checker spot butterfly and its habitat. You develop a conceptual model, identify what the temperature and moisture needs are for that particular animal to persist on the landscape, assess the climate needs and obtain the climate data, develop a sensitivity analysis to a climate future. And to do this, we're developing a climate change surface to understand where the models agree and where they don't agree. And develop an impact assessment, better understand how are these potential changes in the future going to impact this particular animal. And this doesn't always mean a really fancy model. Sometimes you just can tell, like we could tell from our simple analysis here, we didn't need a species distribution model to know that this species is in trouble and for various reasons, and I'll show you why. And then you evaluate the potential of scenarios and associated uncertainties by bracketing the outcomes by using different emission scenarios, which many people have done. And then figure out how your business would change. Understand and manage the risk and costs of how the business would change to continue to have the protection of that species or that target as a goal. So here, define the management goals. Again, here's the outline of the Mount Hamilton project, and here is where the Bay checker spot butterfly persists today. This, in developing a conceptual model or understanding of the important processes, we understand the needs of this particular animal in terms of its, the temperature and the precipitation in fall, winter, and spring. Oops. And we developed the future climate surface by taking the highest emission. I'm showing the highest emission scenarios here for the years 2020 to 2049, and looking at how the 23 models agree and there's the surface of their agreement for predicting that aggregated climate and moisture and temperature space in the future. And so this here is the percent of climate models predicting future habitat. The light is 5%, the top is 40%, and so that means how many of the models are actually predicting that that climate space for that animal will persist in the future. Again, the Mount Hamilton range, its current distribution, and here the dark pink is 40% of the models agreeing that that climate space will agree, and you can see that's not in the year from 2020 to 2049, it's looking kind of grim for the checker spot butterfly, just in terms of whether its climate space persists. But the other requirement it needs is that it relies on the plant Plantago, which only persists on serpentine soils that are marked here in brown. And the final thing is, without trying to do any sort of dispersal modeling or distribution modeling, we know that its maximum annual dispersal rate is this defined by this bubble. So here's where it is now, here's where its future will be, and it's not a really bright future because not very many of the models agree that it can persist there. And so what are the possibilities for persistence of this animal in the future? And then just to put another layer of our business as usual on top of this shows, again, the Mount Hamilton project. The yellow or this weird green is the TNC priority tracks. The dark green is already protected public land, and the gray is other protected land. And you can see TNC, for all the places that we have identified as critically important for conserving biodiversity, we haven't even identified that one spot on the the only place on the planet where that species is going to be able to, that population is going to be able to persist in the future. So certainly, if we were going to protect the Bay checker spot butterfly, we have some serious management issues to deal with. Really, we have two obvious choices. We could invest in assisted migration. We could change our plans, one-time redesign plans, buy land or protect the land in some other way, and then restore the habitat that area happens to be highly degraded, which is why it's not a priority today, with annual costs of relocation, or we could do nothing. And we put this in the context of a full suite, all 2,500 targets that we've identified as important to protect for conserving biodiversity into the future. And so I'm not saying what TNC would choose to do. I'm saying that there are going to be big trade-offs. And for us to understand what these trade-offs are going to be in the future, we need to do multiple simulations across a range of species and a range of matrix communities to understand how best are we going to do this? And we need to do it in different time steps because certainly we're on a trajectory. And it's not good enough just to know how things are going to change in 2080 because that's a massive step from here to there. So then advancing the capability, our capability to adapt. So I'm talking about TNC in particular, but I also, it really does speak to how you need to be thinking about doing business differently in a climate change. We're going into a radically different world than we're in today, as everyone knows here, but really radically different. So we need to, in refining this, we need to refine the methodology to test an array of targets ecological processes and services, and management system, and include habitat fragmentation so we could understand what the movement of those animals in the plants. And we need to define impacts and redefine management goals and strategies and geographic priorities for different timetables on our road to whatever our future is going to be, given that we don't know what scenario pathway we're headed down, and given that we don't know which model is right. We're not going to get answers from those models that we need, and we're not going to know which scenario emissions pathway is the right one until it's way too far. So we need to be making decisions based on just bracketing uncertainty and risk and making business decisions that make sense given our goals. And then we need to eventually reevaluate our goals and evaluate our policy and regulatory barriers that would prevent us from actually implementing those goals in the context of climate change. And I think it's particularly interesting in the context of the bay checker spot butterfly, a federally listed species, that many of the existing regulations might keep it from being protected in the future, even if we were willing as a society to pay for its assisted migration. So those kind of things need to be looked at. We also need to evaluate partnership opportunities, both with partner agencies and private landholders, for identifying the places and the different kinds of management that can support the movement of species in the future and manage for change. And that's it. Thanks.
I know you're. I know you're going to come rescue me, huh? Good. I think I'm close, though. Go ahead. Thank you very much. And I just have to do this in the beginning. I want to thank Director Coleman and Rick Rayburn for putting this on. And I love the state parks. And I only wish we worked more together. We do a lot of things together, but it seems like we always get too busy. And the state parks and the national parks, as far as I'm concerned, are sister agencies, and we really do want to work together, even more so in the future. And Rick's been great. We've been working together for probably 20 years. So I want to just start out by saying right now, really for Department of Interior, and I'm going to speak a little bit for them, not much, mostly for the National Park Service because I'm on this nationwide task force. We're really starting to get momentum. And there's kind of two issues right now that are on the forefront. It's really ocean stewardship and climate change. And for the National Park Service right now, it's really a high priority. And just recently, last spring, we did have this task force get formed, but also Congress asked us to come and testify and say, what are we really doing? Do we really believe in climate change? And are we willing to move forward? And what really are we doing? It's interesting, Dan Kimball, I just got to tell you one little short story. Dan Kimball's the superintendent of the Everglades. And the Everglades doesn't have much topography, right? It's a very large area. The highest elevation is 11 feet. So if you believe the IPCC, the 9 to 23 inches of sea level rise, he loses basically, or he's inundated, about 50% of his park. It changes dramatically. So for the national parks, we're talking about serious, dramatic changes that we're really trying to sort of plan for. And that hearing, by the way, I just have to tell you, when we went to the Appropriations Committee, and Norm Dix is the chair, he's a great guy and very supportive, but it also gives you an idea of how much education we really have to do on this issue. We still have a long ways to go to get people on a higher plateau of what the effects truly are. And we basically, at this point, don't have a lot of guidance, really, even in the Department of the Interior. By the way, we own 1 out of every 5 acres of land in the United States. We're just this tremendous organization. 20% of all lands are in BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, all these different agencies. But really, and I'm not just being facetious, we have very little guidance, and this was done in 2001, this executive order, and I didn't even know it existed until about 2 years ago. So we're starting to move forward, and to really get us into good gear, we established this nationwide committee. And DOI, the secretary, Kempthorne, called us together under the deputy. There were 50 of us. By the way, there's a danger of putting 50, not including me, but 50 smart people in a room and asking them to come up with a strategy for 1 out of every 5 acres in the United States. So we had all these agencies meet many times. We established these 3 committees. I'm going to walk them through with you just a little bit, but this final report that I worked on for quite a long time, and a lot of other people did, is due this winter, and it's really our blueprint and strategy for handling a lot of issues in the Department of Interior. And I happened, which was maybe a mistake because I'm not really law background, but I was put on the Law and Policy Committee. But it was very interesting because I sat with a lot of lawyers for a long time, and we really just went through all the different laws from Endangered Species Act to the Organic Act for the Park Service to all these obscure mining laws, and just tried to figure out which ones need to be potentially changed over time and which one were relevant. I mean, in my personal opinion, even though I would hate the day for somebody to go into the ESA, it probably does need to be altered to take into account climate change. So we went through a background document of all these different things, and the goal really is to help guide the department towards coherent, consistent decision-making. By the way, the most problematic law that we looked at was the Organic Act for the Park Service. And why is that? Because we fundamentally believe in natural process. That's our #1 priority in policy. So what we're going to see is this large list of laws and things that may need to be changed over time in the coming years. And a lot of people, by the way, just our own policies, that's a long discussion if you wanted to change like the National Park Service policies. And then land and water. Again, we own this amazing landscape, and what we were trying to do is just catalog the type of impacts. You've seen a lot of the information today on interior lands, and again, we manage a lot of the Bureau of Reclamation, Mineral Management Services in DOI, so we manage a lot of lands that produce energy and actually produce water for the system. So we wanted to look at the current prospective options for addressing the effects of climate change. And sitting in a room, again, I'm the Park Service with a lot of Bureau Rec people. It wasn't the highlight of my life, to be honest with you. But their role is going to be phenomenal in the future when you start looking at precipitation changes and how we're going to give water to the country. And actually, it was a good experience for me. And then our role in carbon sequestration. I mean, what really can we do? And by the way, this group was really phenomenal in coming up with strategies. That'll all be produced this fall. It'll be a big, thick document that will address some of the national issues. And then science, of course, USGS, which is also in DOI, ended up being a major player in this. And we wanted to focus on climate change science issues, specifically relevant to Interior's responsibilities. My understanding is about a $10 million, which isn't enough money by any means. It's going to be added hopefully this year to get some more additional science done. But we all talked about the different modeling we need to get done on regional scales. I mean, it's obvious that we need that to be done. And we needed to strengthen our understanding of the on-the-ground trends in water availability. Again, that's going to be a big issue in the future. So just moving a little bit, so that's the DOI. Let me just move down. Rick really wanted me to talk about some of the strategies that we're putting in place right now in the Park Service, and I'm pretty proud of our effort. We ended up in the last 6, 7 years being able to double the staff that's focused on natural resources. It was called the Natural Resources Challenge for the National Park Service. So we doubled the staff. We added 83 million. I worked on that for about 3 or 4 years to get it through Congress. So we now have a pretty good base of inventorying, monitoring programs, et cetera, et cetera. So we've also decided that we needed every park unit to have a resource stewardship strategy. And this is a pilot program that Point Reyes is doing. You were not going to be able to do it all. We don't have enough money, so this focuses on the most fundamental values for the park and actually identifies climate change as one of those issues that we need to work on. So we're going to have these strategic plans for each park across the country. They're coming out now, and I think they'll be phenomenal in terms of focusing effort overall, because at Point Reyes I have 28 endangered species. I've got 900 flowering plants. I mean, overall, the job or the task is monumental, so I really do have to focus. So we've had these strategic plans that are coming out. We've also developed over the last 6 or 7 years these pretty phenomenal I&M programs, and we broke the country into 32 strategic areas. They're sort of biological regions. For the San Francisco Bay as one, I'm part of it, and we funded them. So San Francisco Bay has $750,000 that they put into monitoring every year. And the only way you can really do this, I hate to say, it really does, you need money to make them really work. And then we're really working hard now, and I have 4 climate stations now at Point Reyes. We'd added some more just recently, but across the country, we're trying to get these reference conditions set down. We have 2,200 climate stations. So I'm going to call this the foundation. This ecological monitoring, these stewardship plans, and these baseline conditions. And then we're trying to, and I'm going to illustrate these just a little bit, have some diversity of management approaches. And we're getting away, Rick mentioned it before, of just saying, I'm doing a marsh restoration right now, and they're saying, well, put it back to historic conditions. We're saying, no, we're going to put it back to the natural hydrologic function. So we're trying to get it so that it'll adapt over the future. And we're also now making sure every master plan has a component of adaptive management, and we're really pushing ecological restoration. By the way, the Park Service has about $200 million a year they put into line item construction. We're now starting to fund what I would call, which I love, by the way, deconstruction. And what that means is I've got a big project, 2009, in dune restoration. That's not exactly construction, but it's ecological restoration, which we're starting to fund out of that pot. We're also trying to manage, I'm going to show you this vulnerability index for inevitable changes, sea level rise 1 that I want to illustrate. And then we're going to push hard. I think even at Point Reyes, they get 2 million visitors. Most people don't know much about climate change and the effects. And so we're trying to, I'll explain this climate-friendly parks initiative in just a second, but we're trying to accelerate this capacity for parks and learning. And by the way, I want to say, just because I'm giving you the manager's perspective, this adaptive management, everybody says, oh yeah, just do it. Well, it's very complex. And I just want to, this is 15 years of data on harbor seals. This is pups on the one side, and this is, we've been doing adaptive management on a different scale, and you can see pups going up and down based on kayak use, docents, a weather event. We had a rogue elephant seal that we were glad went away. It went into the lofty sky. And a coyote can have a major effect. So you've got these data sets and all these variables that are not only climate change, but you have all these variables that are affecting populations. So when somebody tells me I just can't stand it in a meeting, well, yeah, just do adaptive management. Well, it takes a lot of data, takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of process to really know what you're doing. And the other thing we've launched for most of the coastal parks is these vulnerability indexes. USGS is doing a great job, and this is for Point Reyes. It's 6 different factors, and it basically tells you where you should never build a visitor center, why you should stay away from the shoreline, and it's for siting of future facilities. It's very practical and very good. And you can see the Everglades would be half red, right? overall. And then the other thing, I mentioned it earlier, I have about $10 million worth of restoration projects going on in Point Reyes. One of them, getting rid of non-native deer, I'm sure you've read about. But we're now focusing on doing this natural hydrologic function rather than anything with historical restoration. That's our goal. And I think these large-scale ecological projects like this, and that's mostly the headwaters. This is a ranch here. We're going to put back to wetlands. Thank you, Coastal Conservancy, for doing $1.5 million worth of funding of that. Thank you. We've got to do more of them. It's just the way of the future. And this climate-friendly parks, it's a way that we have a tool now. You can get information on how much carbon you're producing, and you mitigate it, and then you share it with the public, and you get them to help out. And it's a tough process to become a climate-friendly park, which is good. And then just this natural resources management, to expand it on a little bit more, we need to manage, we've talked about it throughout the day, manage on multiple scales, this landscape level driven land acquisition. Park Service has this is the one thing we pushed in the law and policy, so it was a good thing I was in on that committee. The boundary changes for the Park Service often take legislation. Legislation takes forever. So if you wanted to make a purchase, and it's almost impossible to purchase something outside the park boundary. So we need to change that, because in the future, landscape level forces are going to drive these connections. We need to have more flexibility, and the linkages between public areas and protected areas needs to be stronger. And we have to have this ability to adjust boundaries a lot more effectively. We used to have tremendous authority. Congress kind of shut us down. I would love to have the broader authority back. And this regional level management, I'm totally convinced now that I'm on the West Coast Governor's Group for Oceans. You've got to do this kind of scale. Marine protected areas, all this other stuff that's going on. The only way you can be effective is on sort of this large scale. And then these human stressors, you can see we're trying to get rid of exotics at Point Reyes. This is a dune restoration project with volunteers, but we've got to minimize these stressors on the system. And I mentioned marine reserves. I'm a big supporter of ocean protection. And here's what I think NPS needs to continue to do. Enhanced ecological monitoring, we've all mentioned it today. We need to be able to forecast better at relevant levels. We saw some of those projects today. We needed an integrated assessment. By the way, spotted owls at Point Reyes, we've been monitoring from 10 years. Last year, we didn't have one successful nest in the park. Every other year, very high productivity. Is it climate? Is it wood rats? They feed on about 90% wood rats. What's going on? So we need to get an assessment of those impacts, but we need to be working on wood rats, so it's an integrated approach to find out really what's going on. And then I mentioned communication and education. And what the Park Service is going to do for managers, we're going to set up guidelines for how can you really do adaptive management. And obviously the other big thing is partnerships. We can't do it alone. The Park Service has some significant funding. It's never enough, but we need partners to help us out. So here's my summary, and I had to put an exotic deer up here. Manager they must use active ecosystem and adaptive management. It's definitely the way we're heading, and we need to define it a little bit better for the average manager like myself. We need to use these climate change results and just, what do they really mean? It's very complicated overall with precipitation. We really don't know everything. We need to eliminate these threats. And by the way, you're going to have to be bold, because a lot of this is not easy. There are a lot of people that really love some of these non-native deer. But they were basically leaving Point Reyes National Seashore. If we let them go another 5 years, they would have been all over basically Central California in time. But that was not easy. Well, we're not quite done yet. And so we need to lead by example. And as I mentioned before, we really do need to educate the public continuously about some of these threats, because in the end, public support, you got to have it, otherwise you're not being realistic. Otherwise, we're not going to move these issues forward. Thank you very much.
This is embarrassing. I am an electrical engineer. It's really true. Okay, thank you very much. Well, I get to be the last speaker in this session, and hopefully I can leave this session with some thoughts of a potential way to move forward on an issue. But first, let me thank Rick and Ruth and others who have put together this meeting. This is a new area for me, and it's been truly a pleasure to be sitting here today and learning and listening with a group of people who are not only very smart, obviously, and very subject matter expert, but who truly care, and truly care about the stewardship of the planet, and that's really wonderful. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk to you about something that could potentially be an asset to you in decision-making and could be something that those of you who are subject matter experts can be part of. Let me tell you who we are first, and why this kind of activity would be natural for our organization to do. I represent the California Council on Science and Technology, and roughly speaking, if you know what the National Research Council is, the National Academies function at the congressional level, at the federal level, we do the same kind of thing with California experts at the state level. So we were created almost 20 years ago by state legislation. We're a not-for-profit organization. And we are designed to bridge the gap between the policymakers who have the need to know and those who do know can bring that expert advice to the policymakers. We get support from all sorts of people. And we are roughly, between our board, council, and fellows, we represent about 150 of the state science and technology leadership. Many are National Academy members, many are Nobel laureates, etc. I was just thinking here on the Berkeley campus, Beth Burnside, Michael Nacht, Pam Samuelson, John Zeisman, Carl Piester. We bring in and work with people at that kind of level. And we organize ourselves very much like the National Research Council does. And we'll work, and we also have science and math teachers, by the way, because we do a lot in education. And we'll work on any aspect of science and technology that is important, has a policy aspect that's important for the state to be taking action on, or is taking action on and needs advice on. So education, intellectual property, nanotech, biotech, anything that's got a tech or science component to it. We represent and are supported by all the major research universities, public and private, and include the CSU system and the community colleges. And we also have as affiliate members the Federal Department of Energy and NASA laboratories. And by representing, I mean that we engage them in all aspects of our work, and we can tap into their resources and their expertise. So we do all sorts of different projects, but these are three that you might be interested in. It was us that did the genetically modified foods report for the Department of Food and Agriculture that really had quite an impact on legislation, or rather not legislation, for the GMO labeling a few years ago. We were involved in nanotech project that was informing the legislator that both quantum computing wasn't going to solve the state's economic crises, and Michael Crichton's grey goo wasn't going to come down the pipe and hit everybody. See, we have to bridge that gap between the expectation and the reality of the science. It was us who did the intellectual property rules for the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine and did the blueprint for the state's intellectual property rules for state-funded research. And right now we've got projects on education and innovation. We did the Gathering Storm report for the state version of the Gathering Storm report from the academies. We work a lot on energy, healthcare information technology, and using the federal laboratories as a resource in the state. Over the last 3 years, we've been looking very substantively at California's physical infrastructure. This started out with the Institute of Medicine looking at healthcare and has resulted in several bills and quite a few actions from the governor on electronic medical record keeping for patients and healthcare information technology. We've been working with the National Academy of Engineering on energy and sustainability that has looked at nuclear energy, transportation infrastructure, and now has come to regional climate change and more recently to biodiversity. And our last meeting, which was last month in the Beckman Center, was joint with the National Academy of Sciences, and it was on the oceans, and that was with Leon Panetta, and Mike Chrisman came down, and we are involved in that Western Governors project, as you mentioned, Don. So, and this is the kind of thing that comes out of the work that we do. This is on nuclear. Nuclear, as Dan Kamen said this morning, has to be on the table. It has to be considered. It may not be used, it may be rejected, but it has to be considered as part of the option. And Lieutenant Governor John Garamendi has asked us to look at the role of nuclear power in our portfolio. Everything that we do is very substantively peer-reviewed and comes out as a neutral set of recommendations. Well, the recommendations might not be neutral, but the way that the process for producing the recommendations goes through this review system, very much like the academies. So the second one was from Senator Lowenthal, who is the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, and that is, he came to our meeting and said bluntly, we've got $2 billion worth of bond money to spend on transportation infrastructure. We know how to spend money, but that doesn't mean to say we know how to spend it wisely. Can you please help us develop a strategy for developing a process for spending this infrastructure funding wisely? So we are indeed doing that with a group. And then more recently, we've been taking the message that climate change, of course, is a big issue that is hitting all of us in many different ways. But rather than just thinking globally, you can assess regionally and act locally. And many of our folks from Scripps Institution of Oceanography and from Lawrence Livermore and many of our laboratories have come together, NASA laboratories, and said that climate change can be reduced down to what's happening into my backyard, what's happening in the scale of kilometers and what's happening in the scale of years rather than decades and over the size of large land areas. And that's really interesting because that brings the ability to be able to act regionally down to something really practical. And Rick and some of his colleagues came to several of our meetings where we were talking about regional climate change and said, there's a possibility is there a possibility of taking our network of experts and researchers that we can pull together to provide a bridge between those who know the expertise and the policymakers who have to make decisions? And so produce something that is very digestible and very easy to understand and easy to use, but is extremely reliable and can be updated on a regular basis so that it can be a useful tool. And Rick gave us examples, and you've given many more today that are extremely relevant on the very, very serious decisions that many of you are making on how to wisely invest in or take action on land management. And so we have a thought, and it's more than a thought, actually. It's going down to a process, a planning process now. We have our first meeting next week in Sacramento. And that's to work with the Biodiversity Council and for 5 years, identify and clearly present relevant and current research findings about biodiversity and climate change to the best of our knowledge, that on an annual basis, so this is a living, changing kind of report that can be used by land management and regulatory practitioners. So that's taking what's happening at the big level, bringing it right down to what's happening to me, and can I use this information? And this is a reliable and digested way of accessing this information. So our idea is to get a group of people together. Many of you in this room will be hopefully asked to come and join in this because you are the subject matter experts. And through the relationship with the Biodiversity Council and with the Nature Conservancy, and that definitely part of the process, begin to plan out a process for doing this. The idea is to do it on an annual basis. So at the beginning of the year, this group sits down and says, what do we need? What's happened? What's changed? And what do we need to know this year in order to be able to make wise decisions? Midway through the year, we'll come back and have a recap of that, make sure that we're going in the right direction. And there will be a series of deliverables on this. We thought originally in terms of a report. You're probably reported to death if you're like me. You've got bed legs stuck up in your bedroom replaced with reports because you've got so many of them, and you've got telephone directories full of stuff on your desk. So an actual written report might not be the way to do it. Certainly symposia of this nature are extremely important, and we may be able to help pull the right folks together and do that on a regular basis. But how about doing a website? How about doing a web presence that is very accessible and easy to digest? And I say, I'll come back to that in just a second, but look, this is an example of a timeline. In January, we have an executive committee, a group, a steering group, or whatever, that get together. We have a number of principal investigators who are experts from our universities, from our laboratories, who can think about what is needed this year, what is needed in decision-making this year. The principal investigators will go away and collect their information, collect their data, bring it together, and we would work with them to develop an interactive website. Later on in the fall, this committee could meet again and review the findings. This is a peer-reviewed process, as I said, so it has to come out with the authority and the approval of a fairly large number of people. In the late in the year, the website would be launched, and in November or so, it would be made publicly available. And that would happen on a regular basis. And this is just to give you a very, very rough idea. Thank you, Rick, for giving us the names in here of what this could look like. This is probably already trademarked or something, but it's a consumer's guide of information for policymakers who are dealing with land management issues. And it's called the Climate Change and Conservation Research Assessment and New Policy Direction website. It looks at planning, restoration, acquisition, and policy. We call it a toolkit. We've had good experience at doing toolkits before on other projects. We've just done one recently for the Department of Labor, California Wired, Space Authority through their Wired program on workforce issues, because workforce, again, is one of those things that changes and needs information on a regular basis. And so what this does is it looks at the big issues, climate change projections, what's new, what's happened in the last year, what do we need to know. And it looks at these key areas of habitat restoration, land reserves, coastal erosion, and new policies. Then when you open up this, or one of these, what you'll get is a much more detailed listing. You start out at the 20,000-foot level, you come down to specifically what's happening in these topics. This is linked to a Wikipedia, so a wiki site, so you'd have access to the major reports and the major publications that have come out that are relevant in those areas. And likewise, you'd come all the way through to what policies and land managing entities and other resources are available. So that's roughly the idea. The idea is to distill in a way that is very digestible the vast amount of information that is coming at us from climate change down to something that is very practical and is something that you can use as in your policy-making process, and that many of you will help, I hope, shape and design. So.
That's great. You all really packed it in 45 minutes. We do have time for one or two quick questions before we conclude. Anything?
There we go. Is it on? Yeah, there we are. So, hi, Rebecca. Buried in your presentation, it seemed to me, was a kind of an important and difficult question, which is that if, in fact, it would cost $20 million to save the butterfly at Mount Hamilton, should we do that or not? And more broadly, how will we decide what to save and what to let go? Of course, if I had all the money in the world, I'd save it all, but I don't, you don't. So how are we going to make those decisions?
Yeah, I have no idea. I do think though, I do think though, by going through these exercises and seeing what the impacts are. I mean, Craig talked about in his talk that there are just various different responses by different species to climate change, and you don't know what they're going to be. So in some places, you're not going to have to make hard decisions at all because the ranges will expand. In some places, the ranges will contract and will be so small to begin with that you'll have no choice but to have it become a zoo species or do heavy intervention. And when your goal or your mission of your organization is to protect the biodiversity on Earth, there's a lot of species. And so at some point you have to begin to develop criteria. We have criteria now in this static, in that 1765 to present world for saying who's in and who's out. I'm saying in developing, understanding what these impacts are going to be, we're going to have to be coming to terms with how our goal is going to have to change, not how our mission will change, but how our goal is going to change for implementing the mission and what the criteria will be for making those decisions. We already have those in the static environment. We just need to develop them for a dynamic environment.
Okay, one last question. Mike Wells?
This question is for Don. I was just wondering, in the discussions that are going on in NPS about sort of new management paradigms and getting away from historical conditions and, well, not abandoning natural processes, but maybe modifying that. I just wonder if other paradigms such as ecosystem resilience and biodiversity has been mentioned as management goals.
Definitely. I just talked about natural hydrologic process and other things, but definitely biodiversity. Even though our goal isn't really biodiversity. I mean, in some respects, it's more sort of natural process, because you may have a system that's not biodiverse and it may be important to save long term. So, so we do emphasize those, but to different degrees, but definitely. And I do want to say Sam's question is going to be the question of the day. I only have so many dollars to put to endangered species. Even today, I have to make a choice of which ones that we're trying to save. And I think the ESA, it's going to be an interesting question as we go forward, and the drama increases with climate change.
All right, let's give the panel a hand. That was a great job. All right, I'm going to ask the three directors to come on up as we conclude this event. We're going to first hear from Mike Eaton and then Rick Frank and Ruth Coleman. And while they're coming up, I wanted to remind you all that Craig Morwitz, remember Craig earlier in the day, the director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology on the Berkeley campus, is having us over to the museum. You should have a map in your packet for an hour and a half get-together. Most of the speakers will be there, and we can continue the dialogue. So with that, it's up to you all to conclude.
Okay. Mindful of that fact that Craig is going to buy us all a glass of wine or a beer as soon as we're finished, I'll be very brief. I think we've had a very good conversation today, and I hope we see it as a foundation for a continuing conversation, because I think it's important that we take this network and we take this foundation of ideas and move it forward in ways that are useful to you all. With that end in mind, we will be getting back to you very soon in some form, probably email, to solicit your feedback on this event and your idea about things going forward. And just maybe to think a little about what those topics to address going forward, I'll throw out some teasers. We haven't talked a lot today directly about resources, although we've alluded to them, to the issue a lot. And so I'm fearful that, you as a practitioner somewhere will suffer a morning after effect tomorrow, which goes somewhat like this. You've heard that in the regime of climate change, all the stressors that you worry about anyway, invasive exotics, fragmentation, the protecting the hydrologic regime are going to be more severe. You've been told that the mission that probably guides you already, which is thinking and acting at a landscape scale, being aware of opportunities for connectivity, being guided by good science, continue to be important, or even more so under climate change. And the budget you face tomorrow morning is the same as you faced yesterday, which is probably, in fact, a declining budget in most places, and far less than adequate to the job. My friend Kevin Sweeney, who authored the white paper that was made available to all of you, and if you haven't read it, I urge you to. I think it's a very thoughtful synthesis, has observed that one of the things that our Governor Arnold has accomplished with AB 32 and his embrace of the climate threat is to, in a way, begin to rebrand California, not just as the place of Hollywood and beaches, but as the place in the U.S. that is addressing climate change with serious governmental intent and technical innovation. I think in that spirit of rebranding and thinking about message and how we restructure that message, there may be opportunities for us to move the conservation community's response to climate change out of that green box or climate box or environmental box and into the mainstream, because it really is there and it really deserves to be there. We're talking about, in essence, California and what California will be, how it will function, whether it will function 100 years from now. I was also very intrigued by the thought that that kind of a structural rethinking how we talk, rethinking how we brand conversation might lead us in the area suggested by the very nice interchange between Will Travis and Soapy at an hour and a half back about land use and the importance of kind of how we occupy the land and how those decisions are being made. Because it could well be that as we think about getting to there from here, the institutions by which we make those land shaping decisions and the notion of kind of local control as a sacred cow that underlies it may be as obsolete for the future as the SUV, and that in order to really drive the point home and get to the world we need, we will have to rethink governance in a very fundamental way. So those are daunting challenges. I hope, if nothing else, that the takeaway for people from this event today is that you've chosen the right vocation. There is nothing more important to be done over the next few generations than what we all are trying to do for California. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to step out of or away from script for just a second, because a lot of people came together to make this symposium today a success. But I want to tell you that I don't think anybody over the last 3-4 months worked harder and was more indefatigable than one key member of my staff at the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy. You've seen her intermittently darting up here to help with audiovisual aids, but she wasn't in the room when I tried to introduce her earlier. But please join me in thanking for all her help and support Joanne Conlew at the back of the room. In the interest of time, I'm going to be brief as well. 4 quick hits on 4 topics that I'm taking away from this symposium. First, I want to talk for a moment about water. Will Travis surfaced the issue in his remarks, really talking about primarily from a water quality standpoint, but I want to talk about climate change in terms of water supply issues. I think what I see is we're going to have in the years to come, the next 20, 30 years, an increasing number of people and natural resources competing for a declining amount of water resources. As most people know, here in California, 80% of the water goes for agricultural uses, 20% for other uses, primarily urban. But in-stream uses are hugely important, a key component of public conservation land management. And I think with the challenges of climate change, the availability of water for those in-stream uses to facilitate wise land use practices will be extremely challenged. In the early 1990s, the then remarkable development in the Central Valley Improvement Act, reserving 800,000 acre-feet of water per year for in-stream uses in the San Joaquin Valley. I'm not sure in an area of tighter resources where we're going to find those dedicated water resources to manage our conservation lands prospectively. At least at a minimum, it would be a challenge. Another issue I just want to mention, it was alluded to in our last panel and has been intermittently addressed, and that's the issue of federal and state endangered species acts in an era of climate change and the single species approach that are at the heart of each of those statutes. In January of 2008, it's likely that the polar bear will be listed as under the federal act, unquestionably under the criteria that is justified. But that will set in motion some very interesting political and scientific dynamics. Just to tee that up a little bit, assume once the polar bear is listed, we have the next major highway project here in the lower 48 states, or one of those oil shale projects that was talked about comes before federal land management agencies for permitting. How will the Section 7 consultation process play out in the context of climate change, and how will the listing of the polar bear affect that process? To use a phrase I think coined by former Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt, I fear we're approaching some major train wrecks with respect to the implementation and enforcement of the Federal and State Endangered Species Act. And I worry about that politically and otherwise, and in terms of what we ought to be doing together as policymakers, lawyers, scientists. Maybe we ought to be looking at, as one of our speakers said, I think it was Don Neubacher this afternoon, maybe looking at some necessary revisions to those statutes made more necessary by an era of climate change. This conference is a legal conference sponsored by a legal organization and a law school. One person approached me outside during a break and said, "It's remarkable, you're sponsoring a law conference, not one case has been cited all day." We're very close to the finish line, so I don't want to break that streak. It may be the first legal conference in the history of academia where that has not been the case. But one issue that came out of Travis's and Sam's presentation, at least for me, is with the rise in sea level, when we're talking about some of the most valuable real estate on the planet, we're going to have some fairly nasty and potentially intractable property disputes. When I was practicing law and trying cases earlier in my legal career, I did a lot with water boundaries, and the basic rule of law in California and most states around the country, and this is property law is developed on a state-by-state basis, if you have naturally induced gradual changes, the boundary changes. If they are artificially induced changes, the boundary does not change. When we're talking about climate change, where does that fit? I'm not sure. Maybe we need, those of us in the legal academy need to be digging into that issue. Fourth and finally, I wind up exactly where Mike Eaton does, governance models and environmental governance. If climate change shows us anything, it's the need to re-examine those governance models. Again, a number of speakers have touched on that both this morning and this afternoon. Travis talked about some of the key regional issues being faced here in the Bay Area and the fact that a lot of land use management decisions are being made by, I think, 120 local land use agencies, give or take. I see Tony Brunello in the audience, who has, by the way, one of the neatest titles in state service. He's the Deputy Secretary of the Resources Agency for Climate Change and Energy. He, at the state level, and I think leaders like Don Neubacher at the federal level, are really trying to navigate the policy, legal, and land management challenges uncharted, really trying to navigate around environmental governance structures, statutory schemes, single-purpose agency structures that really don't work in an era of climate change that calls more than anything that we've had to deal with for many years for an truly interdisciplinary approach. So I commend to folks like Tony and to Ruth at the state level and to their federal counterparts doing that. But, and we had a spark clearly was created when we talked about some of the disconnects between the needs for national, regional, international approaches to climate change. And throughout at least the United States, certainly here in California, the land use authority is being exercised primarily by local government authorities. And that's a rather interesting disconnect which we may have to re-examine seriously in an era of climate change. Thank you.
Well, again, I want to thank all of you for sticking through the day. This symposium really exceeded my expectations and dreams, and so I'm so pleased. I want to thank staff of state parks who worked so hard on this, because these kind of events don't just materialize. This has been the product of an awful lot of work by Michael Harris, Nina Gordon, Carol Hart, our Parks Commissioner, Rick Rayburn, and then, of course, my two colleagues on both sides of me. And so it wouldn't have happened without their passion. We clearly want to move forward. The whole purpose of today was to bring you all together so that we can start to break down all the different silos that we all work in. And we need to maintain these connections. So we do have our website. We'll be communicating with you by that website. We also have the product that the Biodiversity Council is going to be producing, that's funding. This is another sort of Rick Rayburn brainchild. I want to give Rick a lot of credit, and we sort of passed the hat around at the last Biodiversity Council. My colleague Sam Shuckett pitched in, State Parks is pitching in, there's several other agencies to help pay for what you heard earlier this evening that will be presented to you with that really useful website. There's so much information out there that you really can get into an information overload, and our scarcest resource is our time and attention. And so we're hoping that through this symposium, through that product, we'll be able to all sort of work together and identify all these different strategies and get sort of a best practices website going. One of the questions earlier today had brought up the subject, I think it was from Sac State, about how are we going to communicate to the public. And you've heard several people mention that National Park Service has their climate-friendly parks. We have our own program at State Parks. We're calling it Cool Parks. And we're testing a logo with kids this weekend at the Railroad Museum. We intend to try to message to the 80 million visitors we get at our state parks the notion that climate change is something that affects everyone, and give messages that don't terrify children and don't make adults want to slit their wrists, but do give everybody the sense that they can play a role. There's several people in the audience today who are from state parks from our interpretation department, and they've spent all day here learning and hearing what the effects will be so that they can translate that information into messages and communication devices for the public. Almost everybody in this room interacts with the public at some level. Many of you are managing properties just like we do at state parks. And I think it's so important that we all play a role in communicating to the public so that it gets vested into their DNA just like it is in ours. I don't like military models, and I know I went back to that Ken Burns thing of World War II, but think of the profound shift in the entire American psyche in 4 years and what this country was able to do. There's no reason why America can't change the world just like it did back then on climate change. There's no reason California can't lead that charge, but it does have to start with all of us and then communicating that passion and the urgency to all the people that we come into contact. And we do work with an extraordinarily large portion of the California public through our public lands, and we can connect to people in a way that can speak to them so that then they start helping push their elected officials towards some of these really difficult challenges of governance and other things. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to remind you that Interstate 80 is right now a parking lot. So don't bother getting on the freeway right now. Please come and join us. Walk a couple blocks and join us for drinks. One of the reasons we brought you all together is so that you meet each other and you share business cards. And there's one more opportunity for another hour and a half to start brainstorming what you've heard. And what are some opportunities that we can start identifying questions that we want academia to answer for us? What are some things academia need from us for their research projects? There's so much opportunity still, so use the next hour and a half. So please come. Don't all just jump into your cars or your bikes or your past transit and go home. We would really like you to stick around a little bit longer. And thank you again for coming, and I look forward to seeing you this evening.